Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to stand in the House on behalf of the residents of my riding of Davenport to support Bill C-48, the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. The environment is very, very important for the riding of for the residents of the riding of Davenport, and so I want to stand and support this act. And just for their purposes and for anybody watching sort of ongoing and don't get a chance to watch this live, I just want to review very quickly what the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act does. So what it does is it formalizes a moratorium for oil tankers on British Columbia's north coast. It does three things. It will cover an area from the northern Alaska BC border down to the point on BC's mainland, adjacent to the northern tip of Vancouver Island, and it includes Haida Gwaii. So tanker traffic will not be allowed to go in and out of the ports in the northern part of BC. And this applies to all ships, Mr. Speaker, that are carrying 12,500 tons of crude oil, well, over 12,500 tons of crude oil or persistent oil as cargo within this area. And as well, this tanker moratorium will complement the existing voluntary tanker exclusion zone, which has been in place since 1985. And I know there's been a number of questions in the House to say, well, we have a voluntary moratorium. What does this Tanker Moratorium Act actually do? Well, what it does is it actually expands the current area. So it now enlarges the area. It now includes areas such as the Hecate Strait, the Dixon Entrance, and the Queen Charlotte Sound, also known as off the coast of Haida Gwaii. And the other thing it does is the voluntary moratorium only dealt with ships that were actually passing through the area. And now what this new act proposes to do is it includes all of the traffic that actually goes through the area. So very pleased with these two additional changes, very pleased that this act is going into place. And I know that this is a pristine part of northern British Columbia that for time immemorial we have wanted to protect, and First Nation groups, community groups along the coastline have been asking governments for many, many years for us to protect. And I'm very pleased we made that promise years ago that we would do so, and today we are moving forward in terms of pursuing this bill. The other thing I want to mention is that the Tanker Moratorium Act complements the $1.5 billion Comprehensive National Oceans Protection Plan. And that plan basically has four priority areas. The first is that the Government of Canada will create a world-leading marine safety system that improves responsible shipping and protects Canada's water. So when we talk about world-leading, we mean that the system will meet or exceed the best practices in the world. And this area focuses both on prevention and response measures. Second, the government will focus on the preservation and restoration of marine ecosystems and habitats, and this will be done using new tools and research, as well as measures to direct abandoned and derelict vessels and wrecks. The third priority is building and strengthening partnerships with Indigenous and coastal communities. The government is helping to build local capacity so that Indigenous groups play a meaningful role in emergency response and waterway management. And finally, the fourth part of our Oceans Protection Plan is that the government will ensure that Canada's marine safety system is built on a stronger evidence base, supported by science and local knowledge. So delighted that both of these are going into place. And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, I know that I started off by saying that the environment is very important for Davenport residents. Indeed it is. You know, I've always said to them that one of the key things that we promise as we promise to form government is that we are looking forward to developing our economy, but we want to do it in a sustainable way. And the Oceans Protection Plan and the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act are both part of that plan. So I think what I will do is now move to some of my more formal remarks. And I know in an earlier session there were some questions about government consultations, and indeed there's been extensive government consultations, and I do want to acknowledge the leadership of the member of Vancouver Quadra who did such a wonderful job for years trying to advocate for this. I know there was a lot of consultations at that time. Very proud that we continue to engage in additional consultations, make sure that we reached out to as many groups as possible. We listened and incorporated it into the act that is before us today. So I'm very pleased and proud to be able to take part in today's discussions about implementing an oil tanker moratorium on British Columbia's northern coast. I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight the efforts made by the government and its partners to reach the decision to implement this moratorium. Mr. Speaker, it's important to remember that with this bill, the Government of Canada is honouring its commitments to Canadians. Formalizing this moratorium and improving marine safety are among the priorities set out in the mandate letter from the Prime Minister to the Minister of Transport. We believe it is essential to protect the environment, a particularly sensitive environment in this case, and that's referring to the area in northern BC, while also developing a strong economy. And it's just as important to note that the decision to impose this moratorium is the outcome of a vast consultation project. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to pursuing its objectives in a spirit of renewed collaboration. We firmly believe that it is essential to maintain and enhance our relationships with the provincial, territorial, and municipal governments and with Indigenous groups in order to bring about concrete positive changes. We therefore undertook these consultations when the government first announced its intentions to adopt a legislative framework to formalize the moratorium. The first meetings were held in British Columbia, where the minister brought together representatives from non-governmental organizations dedicated to environmental protection, First Nations, and the representatives from industry, as well as local communities. Discussions were held right across the country, from Iqaluit, St. John's, Montreal, and Calgary, to name only a few locations. And it was important for us to bring together Canadians with differing opinions on the moratorium. The government took great care to include various stakeholders from different settings, namely the marine community, the oil and gas industry, environmental groups, provincial and municipal governments, Canadians from across the country, and of course, First Nations. In total, Transport Canada organized 16 roundtables and over 30 bilateral and multilateral meetings in order to involve Canadians in improving marine safety, which includes discussions about the moratorium on oil tankers, with the aim of extending the discussion further and enabling those who were unable to attend those meetings. Transport Canada set up a web portal. And indeed, Madam Speaker, many letters from Canadians were also forwarded to the department. Overall, nearly 5,000 users visited the online portal. Of them, 330 provided comments or submitted documents. Most of those comments were about the moratorium that is the subject here today. It is obvious that Canadians wanted to be heard. And I can assure you, Madam Speaker, that this was done. We not only listened closely to the concerns of our partners and Canadians about the matter, but we also took steps to meet their expectations. A number of stakeholders expressed concerns, for example, about the moratorium's potential impact on transporting supplies for the communities and industries on British Columbia's coast. Resupply is vital to their welfare. The communities and industries must be able to continue to receive shipments of petroleum products. Therefore, the government ensured that the proposed legislation would allow resupply to continue by setting a threshold of 12,500 metric tons of crude oil and persistent oil in the tanker's cargo spaces. The resupply of communities and industries would therefore not be affected by the proposed moratorium. Some stakeholders clearly pointed out to us that they also wanted to ensure that the moratorium is transformed into action by the Act of Parliament. That is exactly what the bill is proposing. During the Canada-wide discussions, concerns were raised about marine safety. The stakeholders found that the Canadian Coast Guard lacked resources, including salvage tugs. Stakeholders also raised concern about the time required to respond to an incident. The Oceans Protections Plan will allay their concern by giving the Coast Guard, the Canadian Coast Guard, a greater role when it comes to patrols and monitoring the marine environment. The Coast Guard is also going to have increased towing capacity. A number of stakeholders also noted that there could be more involvement from local community in emergency responses, and for that reason, the government is taking plans to better coordinate the federal emergency response plan. With greater resource capacity from coast to coast to coast, the government is ready to work with local communities and Indigenous groups. New Indigenous community response teams will also be established with training in search and rescue, environmental response, and incident command. Remember that Canada is a maritime nation that was built on a safe, secure maritime transport system. This government is dedicated to developing a long-term agenda for marine transport that demonstrates that a healthy environment and a sustainable economy go hand in hand. And in short, Madam Speaker, the moratorium on oil tankers is a major initiative for protecting the BC coast. Thus, I encourage all members to come together and support this bill that protects our environment. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for allowing me to speak on behalf of the residents of Davenport.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. These pipeline projects are of critical importance in my constituency. They contribute to jobs and opportunity in Western Canada, but frankly in all of Canada. For example, there's a pallet factory outside of Toronto, and everything that moves within the oil sands, generally speaking, moves on a pallet. We're all interconnected, so when the government brings forward legislation that shuts down jobs and opportunity, it doesn't just affect my riding, it also affects jobs and opportunity in her riding. So I want to ask the member, why is the government moving forward with legislation that shuts down opportunities for Canada to be in the energy exporting market, creating jobs and opportunity here? At the same time, that market will easily be taken up by foreign oil from countries that do not share our values, that do not share our human rights record, and it will entirely be gratuitously to the disadvantage of Canadians and our economy. So why is the government moving in this direction, and why don't they put jobs and opportunity ahead of their anti-energy ideology?
Honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. I can assure the honourable member that indeed we are putting jobs and our economy at the forefront of our priorities. But I would say to you, and we say it time and time again, that we will move forward in developing and growing our economy, but we will do so in a sustainable way. We have already approved 3 pipelines that will create thousands and thousands of jobs. Most of them will be in Alberta. It will bring a lot of our natural resources to Tidewater. We do have an obligation to develop our resources, but we have to do it in a sustainable way, and that is what we are committed to doing. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Courtenay Albany.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank the member for her comments and the member before her, because she talked about sensitive ecosystems and important marine coastal jobs and protection of the environment. You know, we heard from the member from Vancouver Quadra even identified that there isn't a world-class oil response program in place for the central BC coast. Well, I can tell you something, Madam Speaker. It isn't in place on the west coast of Vancouver Island either. And this government talks about their stakeholders that support this ban. Well, those same stakeholders opposed the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Yet this government went ahead and rammed it through. And they support a project right now where there's no world-class response. There's stakeholders that supports this ban oppose the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And she talked about jobs and the Ocean Protection Plan. Well, there's 100,000 jobs in coastal British Columbia that are being threatened by an oil spill. 10,000 jobs in my riding alone. We know when they talk about their Ocean Protection Plan what it looks like on the ground. No jobs in marine training for Indigenous people, no marine debris cleanups, no closed marine traffic control centres. Will this member stop talking out of both sides of their mouths, this government, and tell us why they supported a Kinder Morgan pipeline with the same principles that this bill is putting out on the north coast of British Columbia?
The honourable member for Davenport.
I very much appreciate the question, the honourable member's question, very much appreciate his passion. I too, you know, when the Gulf oil spill happened, it was something of a bit of trauma for me. I didn't like it happening over such a long period of time. I didn't like that it took so long to stop, the amount of damage that it did. And so I can tell you I was very concerned about how it is we were going to be approving some of our pipelines. But I will tell you that our Oceans Protections Plan is a huge part of that commitment to ensure that we have world-leading means of ensuring that we are protecting Canada's waters, that we have both prevention and response measures, and we are best in class in terms of all of that. I think that's top of mind for all of us. I know, again, we're trying to find that balance between moving forward and growing our economy while doing it in a sustainable way. We are engaging with all the stakeholders, and we're trying to make the most responsible decisions possible moving forward. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the reprise de débat, the honourable member.